Welcome to the Dry Fasting Club and the beautiful world of dry fasting. I'm Yannick Wolf, and I hope to be able to guide you on your dry fasting journey. The following information is not medical advice, so please treat it as strictly informational. The Dry Fasting Club was started with the goal of bringing dry fasting to everyone, bringing science and experimentation to something that has long been considered strictly spiritual. The Dry Fasting Club is a place where new and experienced fasters can get accessible information. Dry fasting is the most powerful form of fasting, but with great power comes great responsibility, and dry fasting safely should always be your number one goal. Paying for a subscription on the site helps out by giving you access to some controversial articles that are hidden from search engines and gets you a quick one-on-one chat with me to discuss all things dry fasting and maybe even more. I highly recommend joining the Dry Fasting Club Discord group, which is free, where you can meet other dry fasters from all walks of life and with different point of views. The one thing everyone can agree on, dry fasting is the best when done properly. Now let's get to today's discussion. Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about how much muscle will you lose on a dry fast. Humans have been involuntarily fasting since the beginning of time. If we didn't have built-in mechanisms to preserve muscle, we likely would have died long ago. So many people are concerned about muscle loss on a dry fast that these types of questions get asked pretty frequently. It's sort of a human condition to want to have it all, so that even when you are undergoing something as drastic as a dry fast for your health, you're still looking at ways to have your cake and eat it too. In this case, people really worry about maintaining their gains, their muscle gains. It's understandable to a certain degree. I'll try to answer the questions as best as possible and guide you in a way that will allow you to make your own decisions on how much you will take muscle preservation into consideration during your next dry fast. However, I will ask one thing of you. Please remember why you are here and that dry fasting is dangerous if done incorrectly and too aggressively. Sometimes this means sitting back and letting the healing forces of your body do what they do best. So, does dry fasting lead to significant muscle loss? When compared to water fasting, dry fasting loses much less muscle. During a water fast, you can expect approximately a 50-50 split on muscle and fat loss. On a dry fast, you can expect something like a 25-75 split for muscle and fat loss. That is a massive difference. Of course, a lot of things can come into consideration, and these numbers can vary slightly depending on a few factors. Especially when you take into consideration that a dry fast takes much less time to achieve something similar and better results than a much longer water fast. The simplified way of looking at this and all of this is that 1 day of dry fasting is equal to 3 days of water fasting. It's worth noting that the extent of muscle loss during a fast can be influenced by several factors, like I mentioned a second ago, including the individual's starting body composition, the total duration of the fast, and any physical activity undertaken during the fast. Moreover, the body adapts to fasting by increasing its use of fat as a primary energy source, thereby sparing muscle protein. So you can see a graph here showing you that this is taken from extended water fasting, and it shows what people at different body mass indexes, how they burn their energy from either protein or fat. And we can see that the leaner you are, you burn more energy from protein than someone who weighs a lot more and has much more fat reserves. Anyways, don't believe me that a dry fast makes you lose less muscle. Take a look at one of my 9-day dry fast photos. I know I used them a few times. Hopefully on my next long fast, I'll take some more pictures. But you can definitely see that throughout the progression of the 200 hours, there was not a lot of muscle loss, but there was definitely a lot of fat loss and water weight loss. When it comes to muscle loss, there are a few key mechanisms to consider. One is glycogen depletion. Muscles store energy in the form of glycogen, which is bound to water. In the early stages of fasting, the body taps into these glycogen reserves for energy. I've talked about this in earlier episodes, and if you remember, each gram of glycogen is attached to 3 grams of water. You can think of this in a simplified way as a 1-to-3 relationship. As the glycogen is utilized, the water it's bound to is lost. This is why you see such a massive drop in weight in the first few days. This massive water loss also means that water from the muscles disappears, and this may make it seem like you have lost a lot more muscle than you think. This is also one of the reasons why it is not recommended to work out at a higher intensity during a dry fast. Number 2, protein catabolism. After glycogen stores are depleted, the body starts to break down protein from muscles to produce glucose for essential functions, especially to fuel the brain and red blood cells through a process called gluconeogenesis. I'll talk about this more later. Just remember there is a big difference between water and dry fasting when it comes to this. Dry fasting is highly preferred for muscle sparing while getting even better health results. Number 3, decreased muscle protein synthesis. Fasting decreases the rate of muscle protein synthesis, the process your body uses to rebuild and grow muscle tissue. This is partly due to reduced insulin levels, which play a role in muscle growth. Insulin levels are correlated to mTOR and growth, while low levels are correlated to AMPK activation. There are some tricks that we can employ here. For example, using berberine strategically, maybe in the refeed, and especially in the preparation period. However, the best thing we can do here is to practice cyclical training by managing periods of AMPK activation with periods focused on mTOR activation. This is naturally done with intermittent fasting, but in our case, imagine a week of fasting and refeeding, followed by 2 weeks of muscle building. You can also talk about the first 2 days of a dry fast, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Number 4, hormonal changes. Extended fasting affects several hormones. Cortisol, the body's main stress hormone, can rise, leading to increased protein breakdown. Conversely, anabolic hormones, which are the opposite, like insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, and testosterone, both which support muscle growth, can decrease. With dry fasting, we experience an intense cortisol increase, much bigger than with water fasting. So based on that, we'd expect even more muscle breakdown. Why isn't this happening? The answer is unknown, but taking this from a logical scientific perspective, it's clear that there are homeostasis mechanisms that get activated in our body in a dry fast that negate the cortisol protein breakdown. So that's a fancy way of saying we don't know, but somehow it works out for us. Number 5, reduced physical activity. People on extended fasts often reduce their physical activity either due to decreased energy or as a deliberate choice to conserve energy. Reduced muscle usage can contribute to muscle atrophy over time. This makes sense, and it is another reason why dry fasting is so much better than water fasting. Because water fasting takes at least 3 times the length to achieve comparable results. What does this mean? It means that it takes 3 times, you'll be doing it for 3 times longer, so the muscles will atrophy from reduced physical activity and reduced protein consumption. You're basically doing a 21-day water fast where you would do a 7-day dry fast. And just that amount of time, it can be one of the main differences in muscle loss. How does the body prioritize muscle preservation during a dry fast? This is another question that gets asked. When people ask for sources, please. There are a few papers here we'll just talk about a little bit and refer specifically in the beginning to the Zebra Finch research paper, and it was called Increased Fat Catabolism Sustains Water Balance During Fasting in Zebra Finches. So this study observed zebra finches, which are a type of bird, in 3 types of situations. Also, I believe that after the day or two of fasting and water fasting, dry fasting, and controls, they did kill or euthanize the birds and broke down their remains to correctly calculate the amount of fats, proteins, etc. In the study, one group was a control group that received both water and food, the second was a water fasting group, and the third was a dry fasting group. They observed that all three groups had good water saturation in their body composition, indicating that metabolic water was being produced in the dry fasting zebrafinch. Metabolic water, for those who don't remember, is water created by your body, so not ingested water. There was enough to keep its metabolic processes functioning, so there was no adverse reactions in the bodies of the finches that were being dry fasted. The great discovery was that the dry fasted zebra finches at the end of the study had much more muscle left compared to the water fasting finches, even though they were not dehydrated. This goes hand in hand with my personal results, as well as hundreds of dry fasting testimonials claiming very low muscle loss on a dry fast. So yes, during a dry fast, the body prioritizes muscle preservation because it's burning more fat. What could be the mechanisms though? There's a few things that we can assume are happening on a dry fast. One is more rapid ketosis. This theory is that dry fasting accelerates the onset of ketosis compared to water fasting. Basically, you enter it faster. When the body enters ketosis, it primarily burns fat for fuel, sparing muscle tissue. Faster entry into ketosis might mean less muscle catabolism. In fact, it most certainly does. So just the fact that you enter ketosis faster on a dry fast means that your body is put into a state that will preserve muscle quicker. Number 2 is increased growth hormone production. Fasting in general is known to increase HGH. Claims that dry fasting does so to a greater extent are primarily theoretical, but it does make logical sense that a more powerful fast would trigger an increased load of HGH production. So once again, this is basically taking information from a water fast, which we have studies and papers on that proves the increased HGH production, and applying it to dry fasting, knowing that dry fasting is stronger. Maybe we can just extrapolate and logically conclude that it also creates HGH, and probably at a bigger scale. Personally, I have noticed that if you safely exit a dry fast, and begin a moderate exercise program that very lightly ramps up, you can gain muscle extremely quickly. So that sort of proves this theory, at least for me. But please beware of working out intensely during the refeed, as the dehydrated muscles will be prone to tears and sprains very easily. This is another thing that I have tested and agree with. Number 3, cellular autophagy. Autophagy is a cellular cleanup process where cells break down and recycle damaged components. If you're listening to this, you have most likely heard about autophagy a million times already. So while both dry and water fasting can stimulate autophagy, dry fasting does so more intensely, which might have protective effects on muscle tissue. This is yet again a logical theory, and the idea behind it is that because of this intense autophagy, our body has more building blocks, including amino acids, and even more basic blocks, circulating in the blood, thereby protecting our muscles from breakdown. Number 4, shorter fasting duration. Of course, we talked about this. If you fast for less amount of time, you inherently spare more muscles on an hour to hour basis. And 5, saving the best for last, is prioritized fat burn. Because hydration is so important, fat cells are prioritized through a process called lipolysis. Fat gets turned into glycerol and fatty acids. These then get converted into energy and ketones. We know this. Fat turns to ketones. That's why it's called ketosis. Both of these reactions generate water upon full breakdown and oxidation, and we know that the oxidation and breakdown of a fat molecule creates much more water than proteolysis, which is the breakdown of proteins into amino acids and further. So just logically, if our body needs water, and if we believe that our body has evolved over the years to efficiently get water from its best source, it will go after the fat. Can you engage in resistance training while dry fasting without risking muscle loss? So resistance training is not advised during a dry fast because you are already losing mass quite quickly. This advice can change a little bit depending on a lot of factors, but if you are very keen on doing some sort of exercise, light resistance training can be most advised during the first 2 days of a dry fast. That phase where you are sort of teetering in the post-absorptive phase and trying to enter ketosis. And there are some theories and studies that will tell you that that's most likely the best way to preserve muscle mass during those 2 days. So even though most of this is water loss, that first quick mass that you lose on the first few days, the early stages of any fast will be the ones that lose the muscle. This muscle is needed to produce both glucose through gluconeogenesis, which is produced from protein breakdown into amino acids like glutamine and supplies the body with necessary components for day-to-day functioning. This early phase, like I just said, is called the post-absorptive phase, and this is where you will lose most of your muscle mass on a dry fast. Once you hit the 48-hour mark, and this is just an average, your fat loss will outpace your muscle loss, and your body will start to preserve muscle mass much more efficiently. So you can also see this on a water fast where we have tons of data, except that it happens past day 7. And those first 7 days, you're losing quite a bit of muscle mass. But basically, ketosis equals muscle preservation. During the first 2 days of a fast, you should be going for light resistance training if your goal is to preserve more muscle. If you engage in resistance training while dry fasting, you do increase the risk of a bit of muscle loss, especially if this is higher intensity resistance training, because of how little amino acids are circulating during deep ketosis. So stay away from it after 48 hours. Any sort of workout during extended fasting will cause reduced recovery. Your body lacks the immediate nutritional resources to repair and build muscle. So basically, when you're in a deeper fast, think about it like you will be breaking more than you can actually rebuild. What strategies can help minimize muscle loss during a dry fast? Getting through the dehydration phase quicker and getting into the acidotic crisis faster. That's the answer. The dehydration phase is also called the post-absorptive phase, like we've said a few times. There is an article on the dryfastingclub.com called Fasting Mechanisms, Understand Ketosis and Starvation, and I highly recommend you take a look if you are interested in these mechanisms. So anyways, it's the time between, so the post-absorptive phase is the time between your last meal and glycogen depletion. Glycogen is a form of glucose that is stored in both your liver and muscles, and it's one of our fastest sources of quick energy. Glycogen depletion takes approximately 36 hours. You'll notice that as the glycogen gets depleted, gluconeogenesis starts to ramp up, and then slowly you have fat burn ramping up, lipolysis as well. So the fat burn is the breakdown of fat molecules. This means that the body realizes about halfway through glycogen loss that we're going to need to start burning proteins and fats because the body is now anticipating that we are entering a sort of starvation mode or period. Side note about fasting and starvation. This is why there's a difference between fasting and starving. In one, you allow your body to fully transition into ketosis. So we see that the body's preparing for it. While in the other, you trick your body by constantly ingesting small amounts of food and glucose, and you basically end up confusing your body and messing with the transition to a healthy fasting mode. So during dry fasting, you can imagine compressing some of these lines, and I'm referring here to this graph that shows you the post-absorptive phase, the gluconeogenic phase, and the protein conservation phase. These numbers in this graph, which can be found on the article on dryfastingclub.com, can basically be compressed when you are trying to look at how a dry fast looks like, since we don't have as much data for dry fasting. But you can compress the post-absorptive phase just a little bit, but then the gluconeogenic and ketogenesis and the protein conservation phase can really get compressed and shifted more to the left. The reason here is because the first day on a dry fast and a water fast are very similar. Yes, you are losing more water, which does speed things up a little bit, but no matter what, you can imagine the first day, first 24 hours to be very similar between both of them. So we're talking about compressing the lines a little bit of this graph for a dry fast, and because of the need for water, ketosis ramps up much quicker, and therefore gluconeogenesis doesn't need to reach as high rates of process. When it comes to strategies to minimize muscle loss, it means you'll need to reach this burst of ketosis as soon as possible. Personally, I don't think it's wise to attempt to speed it up with things like a sauna use or intense exercise, because there are possibilities of overdoing it and putting yourself into a dehydrated state of shock. Letting your body naturally move into it is already pretty stressful. Why exacerbate it? However, if you're insistent on min-maxing the situation, you can do some forms of light exercise on top of walking. Just be ready for a bit more fatigue and intense water cravings. This means a very low-carb diet will minimize muscle loss if done correctly before you enter a dry fast. This is in the Scorch protocol. You will be optimized for protein and muscle building, and you will be in a pretty intense but moderate ketosis. These elements will catapult you into the acidotic crisis much faster. So instead of struggling, let's say for 72 hours, you may only struggle for 36 to 48 hours before you pass the hump. You may actually not struggle at all. If you go through the ketosis shock during your preparation period, that means less struggle during the first few days of the actual fast. This will mean that your body will fire up the fat-burning boosters and transition into that 25-75 muscle loss to fat loss ratio. This is why in the Scorch protocol, I recommend a low-carb diet entry and talk about specific foods and how you should prepare for it. And obviously that changes slightly depending on your situation. And then refeed actually flips the switch a little bit and focuses more on stem cell growth and regeneration, which includes a little bit of glucose and in knowing how far to push it, how to deal with potential relapses when it comes to things like long COVID, and just in general, being able to complete it properly and then transition back into the diet of your choice. There's something called AMPK limiting strategies. I think I wrote that in for people that are really trying to theory craft here. And I just want, if you are interested in this, please check out the article. I'm not going to talk about it too much. It basically talks about cyclical strategies on how to activate AMPK and limit it in the first 2 days. So AMPK is what gets activated during a fast. So it's sort of fighting back against the fasting mechanisms to maintain more muscle. Moving on to the next question. Is there a specific duration of dry fasting that poses a higher risk of muscle catabolism? So the answer is yes. When you reach an underweight BMI, you are entering territory where your muscles will start getting eaten. Since there is a shrinking limited source of adipose fat tissue. Here's information collected from Cahill's starvation paper and Dr. Jason Fung about muscle breakdown from obese versus lean patients. So this is actually very important. A person with a body mass index of 20, borderline underweight, will derive almost 40% of energy needs during extended fasting from protein. So think very skinny people. Compare that to a person with a body mass index of 50 and up, that would be morbidly obese, who only derive 5% of energy from protein stores. Once again, this demonstrates our body's inherent ability to survive. If we have stores of body fat, we use them. If we don't have those stores, we don't. Exactly how much protein is needed during fasting really depends upon the underlying condition. If you are obese, then you will burn more fat than protein. If you are quite lean, then fasting may not be so beneficial as you burn more protein. This seems rather obvious, but our body is really quite a bit smarter than we give it credit for. It can handle itself during feeding and during fasting. How exactly the body is able to make this adjustment is currently unknown. So this last statement basically says that we are still not totally sure of how the body achieves hormesis or homeostasis. And there are situations where lean people can benefit from fasting, and somehow the body will make it work. During prolonged fasting, fat oxidation accounts for approximately 94% of energy expenditure in obese subjects compared to only 78% in lean subjects. Protein oxidation accounts for the remainder of the energy, since there's almost no carbohydrate stores left in the body after the first 24 hours or so. There are other differences between lean and obese subjects too. Lean subjects increase their ketone production much quicker than obese. This is actually quite a good thing to remember. This is easily understood since lean subjects burn a proportionally higher amount of protein. They switch over the fat metabolism much sooner than obese subjects, which will have the effect of sparing protein. So if you are decently lean, pretty fit, and metabolically flexible, you will move into ketosis quicker. And that goes to show as well when we talk about the fasting muscle. The fasting muscle basically prepares you to be more metabolically flexible and compounds with this effect. Other than all of this, it's the early phase before fat burn accelerates that is what you should focus on when trying to preserve muscle. We talked about this. Do light resistance training during the first 24 to 48 hours. Once you run out of triglycerides, you run out of water and energy. At this point, your body is forced to consume the remaining muscle proteins to maintain energy, to have building blocks, and to create water inefficiently. So we'll talk about this situation when you get too lean in this next question. How long can the body sustain muscle mass without protein intake during a dry fast? Maintaining muscle mass during extended fasting is a concern for many, and the body's response can be quite complex. You have to take into consideration the different stages of fasting and how it pertains to gluconeogenesis and ketosis. Your body can enter a state of ketosis within 1 to 2 days on a dry fast, and between 2 to 4 days on a water fast. Very powerful ketosis is achieved around day 3 on a dry fast and day 7 on a water fast. Understanding this is key. The deeper the ketosis, the more muscle will be preserved. Under regular circumstances and short fasts, gluconeogenesis gets most of its glucose from proteins and amino acids. However, once you enter deep ketosis, it's been shown that it becomes much more muscle sparing and uses up to 50% less amino acids. Instead, it focuses on glycerol from fat cells. The brain, which typically relies on glucose, can derive up to 75% of its energy from ketones during extended fasting. So this is another reason why protein gets spared. The brain, which takes a lot of your body's energy, starts to run on ketones from fat cells. This means that once you enter deep ketosis, you will be conserving at least 2 times the amount of muscle. So getting into that deep ketosis is key. This is another reason why a dry fast is so much better than a water fast when it comes to preserving muscle mass. So to answer the question of How long can the body sustain muscle mass without protein is that it depends on your fat reserves and ability to enter ketosis. If you're very skinny, then your body will start to consume more muscle as you enter dangerous weight territory and no more fat. There is a threshold though, which people are unaware of. If you go into underweight territory, your body understands this to a certain extent and slows down the metabolism accordingly. You're able to go for longer on much less. Some people will argue that you need to get down to this level to really dig deep and burn away deep-seated illnesses. So someone in the Dry Fasting Club Discord asked a question specifically on this part and elaborated that Michelle Slater, someone you may have heard of that wrote a book about dry fasting and Lyme's disease, had a very fast recovery and an intense recovery. And the theory behind it is that she actually entered this level of super weight loss where she got extremely lean, almost dangerously lean. And my theory is that this triggers a even more powerful hormetic response that heals you on an even higher level. So this is a bit of a theory, and it is a little bit scary to even test this because you're pushing yourself to very dangerous weight levels, but it's something to consider. If you are a bodybuilder or someone whose main goal is muscle preservation at all costs, then you are the type of dry faster who will benefit most from entering the fast on a high fat and protein diet. This will mean that you will already be in a moderate form of ketosis, and the transition will be much quicker. This means that you will lose less muscle, but the trade-off is that you may not be able to go as long as you want. Entering dry fast in deeper ketosis through a low zero carb prep means that your body will be slightly more dehydrated and will not be able to easily go past 5 days. This is a talk for a dry fast preparation chapter, but just remember that ketosis does not keep you as hydrated as if you are ingesting carbs, which help keep your glycogen levels up, which in turn keep your water levels up. No matter what, when you do any sort of extended fasting, be it water or dry, you will lose some muscle mass. The only way to attempt to sustain muscle mass would be to have some sort of amino acid or protein intake during the fast. However, if this is attempted, you destroy the pure fast, and with it, you alter possible results. If you are looking for the highest level of health benefits from fasting, you need to let your body go through the complete rest of the digestive system without feeding it anything else. With dry fasting, you get the most complete rest, but with water fasting, it's also very close. All right, can incorporating electrolytes or amino acids mitigate muscle loss during dry fasting? Electrolytes would not help mitigate muscle loss, but they could help with certain symptoms. However, during a dry fast, it is important to let the body activate its homeostasis mechanisms itself. To do this, your body needs to very carefully balance its electrolyte levels. We already know that sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium are excreted at higher levels to balance the acidity. Introducing electrolytes could throw off this delicate balance. We don't have enough research on this to know the direct implications. We know that the body has its own mechanisms and they pull minerals out of your cells, out of your bone marrow, your bones, and we want to let it continue these mechanisms without disrupting them. While providing amino acids might reduce muscle catabolism, introducing them would technically break the fast, as they provide substrates that would influence metabolism and your body's homeostasis mechanisms. This turns a dry fast into some sort of hybrid water fast, something more similar to snake juice fasting. What are some signs that muscle loss might be occurring during a dry fast? This is an interesting question, but also a bit of a silly question. You are usually dry fasting with a goal in mind. The goal is not to build bigger muscle, unless you are experimenting with HGH, human growth hormone spikes. Knowing this, you can really throw off your mental game by overstressing about symptoms. Most symptoms that could be correlated to muscle loss can also be correlated to various mechanisms and detox symptoms that you undergo during a dry fast. I guess this changes a little bit if you are already severely underweight, and you do need to take some more precautions. A lot of symptoms that could technically be muscle loss can also be glycogen depletion, fluid balance, offset, mineral balance, blood thickening, acidosis, and toxins in the bloodstream. If I had to pick one symptom that would be very important to track for overall health and safety, on top of a sign of muscle loss would be a decrease in urine output. This is why when I coach or consult for dry fasting, I also ask that you collect your urine in jars if you are going to be going for really extended fasts. During a dry fast, you eventually reach a urine output balance. This is dependent on your ketosis threshold, which means the maximum amount of fat cells that your body can process at a given time. This is somewhere around day 3. So if urine drops from baseline deeper into the fast, it could mean that you're running out of fat storage and the body has started moving onto muscle. Muscle produces less water, as well as you have entered into dangerous dehydration territory, both caused by insufficient fat breakdown and too much fluid loss to things like perspiration and metabolic processes. Urea is correlated with muscle catabolism, so muscle loss. Urea does not always mean that there is muscle breakdown occurring, because there may be other situations such as eating a high protein diet. A lot can play into this, such as kidney health and function. However, when you are fasting and your urea drops, it both indicates there is no incoming amino acids either from your diet or from your muscle breakdown. And the reason I just talked about urea is because I have a graph in this article here that shows the massive shift from a non-fasted state to an extended fasting state, where your urea drops more than 90%. And to finish off, a secondary symptom to keep an eye out is temperature regulation. And in this case, getting cold later on in a dry fast. So you should be feeling heat. The first days of a dry fast are very similar to a water fast. So this is normal. The first days are where you actually feel colder. But once you pass the initial days and pass the acidotic crisis, so around day 3, suddenly your heat skyrockets and you start to feel the dry fasting burn. This heat is both a blessing and a curse. It makes you feel the healing through the excess energy being metabolized, but it also makes you feel like you're overheating. So terrible during the summer. Thanks for sticking around. Let me know what you think, and I will catch you in the next one. And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it and got some good information out of it. If you know anyone that this information could benefit, please share it. If you have any questions, you can leave them as comments under the website article at dryfastingclub.com. Don't forget to join the Discord group, and if you're interested in diving a little deeper, feel free to schedule a chat with me. I have many small hacks and experiments that have not made it into the articles yet, but may be suitable for your situation on a case-by-case basis. Thank you for listening. Until next time, good luck on your dry fasting journey.